Well, good afternoon, everybody. The difficulty with going last is that people may have said everything you're going to say, so we'll see how it goes. I decided to give myself a title. And the title for what I want to talk to you about is this. It's the new norm is not the old norm with a different hat on. And by that I mean that when I hear people talking about the so-called new norm after COVID, it's very difficult for people to imagine anything beyond what we had before. So our imagination tends to go backwards rather than forwards. And I want us to think forwards about what post-COVID imagination might look like and what the new norm might look like in a radically different way. So there's 4 points that I want us to think about. They kind of run like this. First one is from Palm Sunday to resurrection. The second one is from scarcity to abundance. The third one is from lockdown to Sabbath. And the fourth one is from social distancing to love and trust. So I'm going to work through these 4 points in the little bit of time that I've got. Now, the first thing to notice is that if we think about it, the old norm wasn't all that great. You know, at the beginning of the pandemic, John Pilger, an Australian journalist, spoke about what he thought that the COVID exacerbates, makes worse for Western society in particular. This is what he says. Now think about it. He says, a pandemic has been declared, but not for the 24,600 who will die every day from unnecessary starvation, not for the 3,000 children who die every day from preventable malaria, and not for the 10,000 people who will die every day because they're denied publicly funded health care, and not for the hundreds of Venezuelans and Iranians who die every day because America's blockade denies them life-saving medicines, and not for the hundreds of mostly children bombarded or starved back to death every day in Yemen in a war supplied and kept going profitably by America and Britain. Then he ends by saying, before you panic, consider them. There's something really important about that we don't look at the old norm through rose-tinted glasses and begin to think that actually this may be an opportunity that we have to take. And one way in which we can think about it is thinking about the movement from Palm Sunday through to the resurrection. Now think about it. Palm Sunday was a time of great celebration and hope. The Messiah had come. These guys thought that something wonderful and fantastic was about to happen. And in their minds, they had a very particular picture of what that fantastic thing should be. Then you have the passion. You have the pain, the chaos of the cross. You have the loss. You have all the things that they hoped for seem to absolutely vanish in the apparent disaster of the cross. But then there was the resurrection. And the resurrection doesn't transform everything, but it helps us to reframe everything and see the world differently. So the resurrection becomes the new norm. But the interesting thing and the important thing for us is that that new norm wasn't what people expected. It wasn't a movement back to Palm Sunday hopes and a Palm Sunday imagination. It was a movement into something new, something different. And so I think that what we need to think about is how can we develop a post-COVID imagination that doesn't constantly get drawn back to a kind of glossy picture of the way things were, but moves us on in vital and above all faithful ways. So the second point is from scarcity to abundance. Walter Brueggemann, who's a very interesting Old Testament scholar, talks about a scarcity mentality. He says that Pharaoh introduced a principle of scarcity into the world economy because he was so afraid that his abundance was going to be taken from him that he oppressed the slaves. He was constantly gathering stuff to himself. And Brueggemann says this. He says, money is becoming a kind of narcotic to us. He says, we hardly notice our own prosperity or the poverty of so many others. The great contradiction is that we have more and more money and less generosity, less and less public money for the needy, less charity for the neighbor. Now, when the COVID crisis started, I was in Australia. And the big thing in Australia at that time was toilet roll. Everybody wanted toilet roll. Nobody really knew why, but everybody had to have it and have it in abundance. And so people were fighting in the supermarket about toilet roll. And then when the toilet roll situation sorted itself out, they started fighting about food. And eventually the shelves were empty in supermarkets. Now within that particular country, like us, there's enough food in the country to feed people 3 times over. But as soon as we saw a threat to what we thought was something really important to us, as soon as we recognized or developed our scarcity mentality, everything seemed to fall apart. And what was worse, we were hoarding stuff in a way that prevented the weakest and most vulnerable amongst us from having that stuff. So once our barriers of defense go down, once we are threatened in that way, we begin to see a scarcity mentality that not only draws upon our individualism and selfishness, but actually is profoundly dangerous to the most vulnerable people within society. I think COVID has drawn that out, and we have to do something with that. The third point I want us to think about is the idea that perhaps lockdown and Sabbath might be connected. You know, I hear a lot about people being bored, and that's true, but lockdown can be quite boring, and particularly if you're not able to structure your day in a way where you have a good rhythm that takes you from morning to evening. Every day becomes exactly the same, like Groundhog Day. But it strikes me that one way in which we can move beyond our scarcity mentality to a generous imagination is by thinking in terms of Sabbath. Sabbath is a space that God asks us to take in the week in order that we can focus in on who He is, what He has done, and what God means for the future, our own future. It seems to me that lockdown, if we understand it as a gift within which Sabbath can become a reality, perhaps in a way it couldn't be before, and perhaps in a way it can't be in the future, there's something very powerful about that. Because Sabbath helps us to develop the habits of recognizing God for who God is, and the habits of generosity that are necessary for us to live faithfully with that particular God. So the idea of lockdown as Sabbath is important, and embodying the habits of generosity. And the final point that I want us to think about, it relates to from social distancing to loving trust. I don't know if you've noticed the change in language that the Scottish Government in particular have begun to use in relation to social distancing. Nicola Sturgeon, I noticed in all of her public appearances, doesn't use the term social distancing. She's using the term physical distancing. And there's something very, very important about that, because social distancing is a relational term. Physical distancing is a medical term. It comes from public health. It tells us to keep a distance in order that we don't infect one another and don't put one another in danger. Social distancing is something quite different. It indicates that we should no longer relate with people in the way that we normally do. And so I think that shift in language is important. It's important for us to think about that shift in language. One of the most challenging things, perhaps, is that social distancing is an experience that many marginalized people live with day after day after day after day. I spoke to a woman who lives not far from here, and she said to me, she's an elderly woman, she said to me, you know, I've been social distancing for 10 years. Now this virus comes and people want to come to and speak to me and to give me all these things. But who remembered me before the virus came? And so social distancing is something that people experience in a negative sense in a variety of contexts. And also social distancing, in one sense, is one way in which we can describe stigma. Stigma which alienates us from our community, which alienates us from one another. So physical distances, medical term, social distancing takes us into somewhere quite differently. Now the danger is that whilst physical distancing is obviously necessary, the danger is that we end up developing a culture of distancing. You know, I've been doing some research work recently on carer presence with people with dementia. Because some of the problems some people have sometimes is that they're present with people with dementia, but they're not completely engaged. So I've been looking at some stuff. But one of the things that I've noticed is that absence is becoming a cultural norm for us. You know, if you sit in a restaurant and watch people, you'll have 4 people around the table and they'll all be on their phones, but they'll be in the same room, but not in the same way. They're present, but not present at all. And so social media contributes to that idea of absence being a cultural norm. The danger with social distancing is that we get so used to it, we end up having a culture that's not only absent, but also socially distancing. So there's some really important cultural and relational dynamics that we need to push into and think about that emerge from the COVID crisis, but also that emerge from the way that we talk about the COVID crisis, because the language that used to describe something very often indicates what kind of actions we're going to take in response to that. So these 4 points are the points I'd like to put on the table. So thank you.